The rope was already around his brother's neck when Gideon Archer rode into Sweetwater Crossing, and it was the sound of humming, not the sight of the gallows, that stopped his heart cold in his chest. It was the spring of 1878, the kind of pale gray morning that hung over the Wyoming Territory like a held breath, and the town of Sweetwater Crossing had gathered in its dusty square the way towns did for weddings or funerals, except this was neither, or perhaps it was both at once. Gideon had ridden 3 days straight from Fort Laramie on a rumor, a name scratched into a saloon ledger, a description that matched a boy he had not seen since the boy was 9 years old, and Gideon himself only 14. He had chased 100 such rumors across 17 years, and 100 times they had led him to nothing but dust and disappointment. He did not expect this one to be any different. He had only stopped in Sweetwater Crossing because his horse needed water, and because the crowd in the square had drawn his eye the way a gathering crowd always did, out of a tracker's habit of watching for danger before it found him. Then the crowd parted enough that he saw the platform, and the man standing upon it with his hands bound, and a rope looped snug beneath his jaw, and the man was humming, low and rough, a tune that Gideon had not heard in 17 years, but that lived in the marrow of his bones regardless. It was the lullaby their mother used to sing over the wash basin on Sunday evenings, back in the Missouri farmhouse that had burned to memory long before either of them was grown. Gideon had hummed it himself, alone, more nights than he could count, in bunkhouses and lined shacks and empty prairies, trying to keep some small ember of his mother alive. To hear another voice singing it, a voice roughened by fear and thirst but unmistakably shaped by the same childhood, struck him like a physical blow. He was off his horse before he had decided to dismount, pushing through the crowd with a force that drew curses and startled looks, and when he reached the front, close enough to see the platform clearly, he stopped as if he had run into a wall. The man's face was leaner than a boy's face ought to be, weathered by sun and hardship, a beard covering what had once been a smooth young jaw. But the eyes were the same gray-green eyes that had looked up at Gideon from a shared straw pallet a lifetime ago. And there, just visible above the collar of his shirt where the rope had shifted it aside, was a puckered white scar shaped like a crescent moon, the mark left by a branding iron that had grazed his shoulder when he was 6 years old and had wandered too close to their father's forge. "Caleb," Gideon said, and the word came out of him broken, disbelieving, loud enough that heads turned. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Tom Whitlock with a mustache gone gray before its time, held up a hand toward the hangman, a gesture that might have meant wait or might have meant nothing at all, an old habit of caution in a man unused to being interrupted. "Who in blazes are you, mister, and what business do you have hollering in the middle of a lawful execution?" "That man is my brother," Gideon said, and his voice cracked down the middle like a dropped plate. "That man is Caleb Archer, and I have been looking for him for 17 years, and you are not going to hang him before I have had the chance to say his name to his face." On the platform, the condemned man's head came up sharply, and the eyes that met Gideon's across the square went wide with a shock that mirrored his own. "Gideon!" The word rasped out of him like something long buried finally breaking the surface of the earth. "Gideon, is that truly you?" the crowd murmured, a low rolling sound like wind through dry grass, and somewhere near the platform a woman's voice rose clear and sharp above the rest. "Sheriff Whitlock, if there is any doubt at all about this man's identity or his guilt, you cannot in good conscience let this proceed." Gideon turned and found the source of the voice. A woman perhaps 27 years of age, dark hair pinned beneath a plain straw hat, a notebook clutched in one hand and a pencil in the other, standing near the front of the crowd with the kind of stillness that came not from calm, but from long practice at holding herself steady in the face of things that frightened her. She had ink-stained fingers and a spark in her eyes that suggested she was not accustomed to being told to be quiet, and she was already moving toward the sheriff with the determined stride of someone who intended to be heard. "This is not your concern, Miss Dugan," Sheriff Whitlock said, though there was less certainty in his voice than there had been a moment before. "It is precisely my concern," she answered. "I am the editor of the Sweetwater Crossing Gazette, and it is my business to make certain that justice in this town is not simply whatever Silas Hargrove decides it ought to be on a given morning." She turned to address the crowd now, raising her voice so that it carried. "This man has stood trial before no judge. Judge Pearson is not due to arrive from Cheyenne until 3 days from now for the Territorial Circuit Court session. What is happening on this platform is not justice. It is murder wearing justice's clothes." A ripple of unease passed through the gathered townsfolk. Near the base of the gallows, a tall man in a fine gray coat and a black hat stepped forward, his boots polished despite the dust of the square, his face composed in an expression of patient, wounded reasonableness that Gideon distrusted on sight. "Miss Dugan," the man said smoothly, "I understand your newspaper thrives on controversy, but a man was murdered on my land, and this man was found standing over the body with the murder weapon in his hand. There is no controversy in that, only tragedy, and the sooner this town puts it behind us, the sooner we can all return to our lives." "That is your account of events, Mr. Hargrove," Abigail Dugan said, "and I notice that it is the only account anyone has troubled to gather. Where is the eyewitness testimony? Where is the coroner's inquest? You have been very eager to see this resolved quickly, and I confess I find that eagerness more suspicious than reassuring." Gideon barely heard the exchange, for his eyes had not left his brother's face. 17 years of searching had worn grooves into him the way water wears grooves into stone, and now that the search had ended, standing here with a rope around Caleb's neck and a hangman's hand upon the lever, he found himself unable to move, frozen between joy and terror in equal and paralyzing measure. "Sheriff," Gideon said again, forcing his voice to steady, "I am asking you, as one man to another, to give this 3 days. Let the circuit judge hear the case properly. If my brother is guilty, then let him be found guilty by a court of law, not by a rope tied in haste on the word of one man who happens to own half the land in this county." Silas Hargrove's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a small crack in the smooth composure. "This is theater, Sheriff. This drifter rides into town claiming kinship with a convicted murderer at the very moment of his execution, and you would delay the course of justice on his word alone." "He is not convicted," Abigail said sharply. "He has never stood trial. You seem to keep forgetting that particular detail, Mr. Hargrove." Sheriff Whitlock looked from Hargrove to Gideon to the pale, hollow-eyed man standing on the platform with the rope still around his neck, and something in the sheriff's weathered face shifted, some old and buried sense of duty stirring beneath the layers of fatigue and political convenience. He had been sheriff of Sweetwater Crossing for 9 years, and in all that time he had never hanged a man who had not first stood before a judge, and the fact that he had allowed himself to be talked into doing so now, under pressure from Hargrove's money and Hargrove's influence, sat suddenly ill in his stomach. "Cut him down," Whitlock said. Sheriff Hargrove began. "I said cut him down, Silas. Judge Pearson arrives in 3 days. He will hear the case properly, with witnesses sworn and evidence presented, and if the jury finds this man guilty, then he will hang and hang lawfully. But I will not have it said that Tom Whitlock strung up a man without so much as a trial, not for you, not for anybody." The sheriff's voice had found its old iron by the end of the sentence, and the hangman, after a glance at Hargrove that received no reassuring signal, stepped forward and loosened the rope from around Caleb Archer's neck. Caleb's knees buckled the moment the rope came free, and he might have fallen from the platform entirely had Gideon not shoved through the last of the crowd and caught him beneath the arms, holding his brother upright with a grip that trembled from something far deeper than physical strain. "I thought you were gone," Caleb whispered against Gideon's shoulder, his voice cracking apart entirely now that the danger had passed, and there was room for 17 years of grief to surface all at once. "I thought you had died or forgotten me, or—" "I never stopped looking," Gideon said, and he held his brother the way he had held him as a boy, fierce and unashamed. While the crowd watched and Silas Hargrove turned on his heel and walked away without another word, his shoulders stiff with fury barely contained. Abigail Dugan stood a little apart, watching the reunion with her pencil forgotten in her hand, and something about the rawness of it, the unguarded love between two men who had clearly believed each other lost forever, settled into her chest and stayed there long after the crowd began to disperse. The jail at Sweetwater Crossing was a squat adobe building with 2 cells and a single barred window that let in more dust than light, and it was there that Sheriff Whitlock returned Caleb Archer, not because he believed the man guilty, he admitted quietly to Gideon as they walked, but because the law required somewhere for an accused man to stay until his trial, and there was nowhere else in town suited to the purpose. 3 days, the sheriff said, as he turned the key in the cell door. I will do what I can to see this handled fair, Mr. Archer, but I will tell you plain, Silas Hargrove owns the bank, the feed store, and half the grazing land in this county, and men who cross him tend to find their lives made difficult in ways that are hard to trace back to any one cause. You would do well to move careful. I intend to prove my brother's innocence in 3 days, Gideon said. I do not much care whose grazing land that inconveniences. Whitlock studied him for a long moment, something like respect flickering behind his tired eyes. Then I hope you are as good at finding truth as you were at finding your brother, Mr. Archer, because you are going to need every bit of that skill before Judge Pearson's train pulls in. Left alone in the small, dim front room of the jailhouse, the 2 brothers sat on opposite sides of the bars, and for a long while neither of them spoke, simply looking at each other as if trying to reconcile the boy each remembered with the man now sitting before him. You have Pa's hands, Gideon said finally, nodding at where Caleb gripped the bars. You have Ma's eyes, Caleb answered, and something that was almost a laugh, thin and disbelieving, escaped him. I used to dream about you, you know, for years. I would dream you came back for me at the Hendricks farm, and then I would wake up and you never had, and I told myself eventually that you must be dead, because I could not bear to think you were alive somewhere and simply had not come. The words landed in Gideon like a blade, and he did not try to pretend otherwise. I went back for you, he said, the autumn after they split us up. I had found work on a cattle drive, saved every dollar I could, and I went back to the orphan asylum in St. Joseph to fetch you, and they told me you had already been placed with a family and sent west on the train, and they would not tell me which family or which direction, because the records had been lost in a fire that spring. I searched every county I could reach for years, Caleb. I wrote letters to every orphanage and every homestead office between here and the Mississippi. I am not asking you to forgive 17 years, but I need you to know that I never once stopped trying to find you. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, his throat working, and when he spoke again his voice had softened. The Hendricks family were not unkind, but they were not warm either. They needed hands for the farm, and I was hands to them, nothing more. I left as soon as I was old enough to make my own way, drifted west, worked cattle, worked mines, finally saved enough to file a homestead claim here 2 years back, on a stretch of good bottomland along the Sweetwater River. I thought I had finally built something that was mine. His hands tightened on the bars. And then 6 weeks ago, a man named Ezra Cole turned up dead in the field behind my cabin, shot through the chest, and I was the one who found him. And by the time I had run for the sheriff, half the town had already decided I had done the killing myself, on account of the argument Cole and I had at the saloon the week before, over nothing more than a game of cards. Tell me about Hargrove, Gideon said. The sheriff spoke his name as though it carried weight and not the good kind. Silas Hargrove has been trying to buy my land for the better part of a year, Caleb said. My claim sits square across the best water access on that stretch of the river, and Hargrove's cattle operation has been growing faster than the range can support. He offered me a price twice what the land is worth, and when I refused, the offers turned into visits from men who were not so friendly, and fences that got cut in the night, and cattle that wandered onto my land and had to be driven off before they trampled what little I had planted. When Ezra Cole turned up dead on my property, it solved every problem Hargrove had. My claim goes up for auction the moment I hang, and there is only one man in this county with the money to buy it outright. Gideon felt something cold and clear settle into place inside him, the particular stillness that came over him before violence, though he forced himself to set the feeling aside, because his brother did not need a man driven by rage. He needed a man driven by patience and by proof. "Then we will find who truly killed Ezra Cole," Gideon said, "and we will lay it at Hargrove's door where it belongs." It was Abigail Dugan who found him that evening, standing outside the jailhouse in the long orange light of a Wyoming sunset, staring down the empty street as though it might yield answers if he looked at it hard enough. "Mr. Archer," she said, and he turned to find her approaching with a basket over one arm, the same notebook tucked beneath the other. "I thought you and your brother might have need of a decent supper. The jail does not exactly keep a fine kitchen." "That is kind of you, Miss Dugan," Gideon said, and meant it, though he was wary too, unused to kindness arriving without a price attached. "Though I confess I am curious why the editor of the town newspaper takes such an interest in my brother's fate." "Because I do not believe he did it," Abigail said simply, "and because I have watched Silas Hargrove strangle the life out of this town for 3 years now, buying up land, buying up loyalty, buying up silence, and I have grown very tired of writing polite little articles about cattle prices, while a man who behaves like a king in all but name does as he pleases. My father built that newspaper on the principle that the truth belongs to everyone, not only to those who can afford to purchase a different version of it. He died 2 years ago, and I have tried to keep faith with what he believed, though it has cost me more than a little trouble with Mr. Hargrove." "Trouble such as what?" "Such as advertisers who suddenly find they cannot afford to place notices in my paper, and a bank that has grown strangely reluctant to extend me credit for new type and paper stock, though somehow always finds funds enough for Mr. Hargrove's ventures." She said it lightly, but there was steel beneath the words, and Gideon found himself studying her with new interest, the way a man studies a fellow traveler he suspects might be heading the same direction he is. "Then perhaps we ought to travel together for a while, Miss Dugan," he said. "I have 3 days to prove my brother innocent, and you seem to have 3 years of grievance against the man most likely to have arranged his guilt. I would welcome the help of someone who knows this town and this county better than I do." Something in her expression eased, a wariness giving way to something warmer, and she extended her hand to him in a gesture more suited to a business partnership than a courtship, though Gideon found himself holding it a moment longer than strictly necessary before releasing it. "Then we have an agreement, Mr. Archer," she said. "Come. Let us feed your brother before his supper goes cold, and then you and I shall begin at the beginning, at the place where Ezra Cole died." They rode out to Caleb's homestead the following morning, Gideon on his own weary horse and Abigail on a sturdy chestnut mare she called Independence, a name that made Gideon smile despite the gravity of their errand. The homestead sat in a wide bend of the Sweetwater River, good grazing land climbing gently away from the water toward low hills furred with sagebrush, and Gideon could see immediately why Hargrove coveted it. The river bent here in such a way that it created a natural watering hole large enough to serve a herd of considerable size, one of the few such spots for miles that did not run dry in the height of summer. The cabin itself was small but well built, a single room with a stone chimney, and a lean-to for a horse that had apparently been sold off or driven away sometime after Caleb's arrest, for the corral now stood empty. Behind the cabin, a patch of trampled grass marked where Ezra Cole's body had been found, though 6 weeks of weather had erased most signs that might have told a clearer story. "Tell me what you know of the argument at the saloon," Gideon said, crouching to examine the ground though he expected to find little of use. "According to what I gathered for the paper," Abigail said. "Ezra Cole accused your brother of cheating at cards, and there were words exchanged, and your brother left the saloon rather than come to blows. Several witnesses confirmed that much. But the sheriff never troubled to ask why Ezra Cole, a man with no known connection to this stretch of land, happened to be found dead behind Caleb's cabin 6 days later, in the middle of the night, when by all accounts the two men had not spoken since the card game. Who was Ezra Cole when he was not being murdered on my brother's land? A drifter, by most accounts. He arrived in Sweetwater Crossing perhaps 2 months before his death, took occasional work at the livery stable, spent most of his time and most of his wages at the saloon. No family that anyone in town could name. No history that anyone troubled to investigate, because a dead drifter with no family to demand answers is a very convenient sort of murder victim." Gideon straightened, brushing dust from his knees, and looked toward the low hills beyond the homestead with the particular attention of a man who had spent years reading trail sign for a living. "A man does not walk 6 miles from town in the middle of the night without reason, Miss Dugan. Either he came here on his own errand, or someone brought him here, or paid him to come. I think we ought to speak with whoever employed him at that livery stable, and I think we ought to learn whether Ezra Cole had any dealings with Silas Hargrove before he ever crossed paths with my brother." The livery stable owner, a stooped, taciturn man named Wallace Prout, proved reluctant to speak at first, casting nervous glances toward the street as though he expected to be observed. But Abigail's patient questioning and the promise that her newspaper would print his name only as a witness protected by law, not as a man taking sides, eventually loosened his tongue. "Cole came around asking after work about 2 months back," Prout admitted, "and I will say this much, he did not seem like a man who needed the wages. His boots were too fine, his gun too well kept for a fellow supposedly down on his luck, and I saw him twice of an evening walking out toward the Hargrove Ranch house, though he never spoke of it to me directly." "Would you be willing to state that under oath before Judge Pearson?" Gideon asked. Prout's face paled several shades. "I have a family, Mr. Archer. I do not relish the notion of crossing Silas Hargrove in open court." "I understand the fear," Abigail said gently, "but consider this, Mr. Prout. If Silas Hargrove is capable of arranging the death of one man to seize a piece of land, what makes you believe your silence protects you any better than your testimony would? A man like that does not reward cowardice with safety. He rewards it with the confidence that he may do as he pleases to anyone at any time because no one will dare speak against him." The stableman was quiet for a long moment, working his jaw, and finally he nodded, a short, unhappy jerk of his chin. "I will tell the judge what I saw. I will not embellish it, and I will not lie for you, but I will tell the truth as I know it." It was, Gideon reflected as they rode away, the first solid thread in what might become a rope strong enough to hang Silas Hargrove's scheme instead of his brother, and he found himself glancing sideways at Abigail Dugan with a gratitude that went beyond mere professional partnership. "You are very good at this," he said, "drawing truth out of frightened men." "I have had practice," she said. "This is not the first time I have gone digging where Mr. Hargrove would prefer I did not dig." She hesitated, then added more quietly, "My father died in a wagon accident on the Cheyenne Road 2 years ago. The wheel came apart in a way our blacksmith said should not have happened to a wheel so newly repaired. I have never been able to prove it was anything other than misfortune. But my father had written 3 articles that spring questioning Hargrove's water rights claims along the river, and I have never quite believed that the timing was coincidence." Gideon felt something in his chest twist with a protective anger. He had no right to feel so quickly for a woman he had known scarcely a day, and yet there it was, undeniable, sitting alongside the gratitude and the growing admiration. "Then we have more in common than a single case, Miss Dugan. We are both of us hunting a truth that someone has worked very hard to bury." That evening, they sat together at the small table in the back room of the Gazette office, poring over the newspaper's back issues by lamplight, searching for any prior mention of Ezra Cole, of Hargrove's land dealings, of anything that might build toward a fuller picture. Abigail's fingers, stained permanently gray-black with printer's ink, moved quickly through the stacked papers, and Gideon found himself watching those hands more than he watched the print, admiring the quiet competence in them, the way she handled each page as though it held some fragile, important thing. "You are staring, Mr. Archer," she said without looking up, a faint smile touching the corner of her mouth. "My apologies," he said, though he did not look away quickly. "It has been a long while since I sat across a table from anyone I did not intend to either fight or leave behind by morning. I find I am somewhat out of practice at ordinary company." "That sounds like a lonely sort of life." "It has been," he admitted. 17 years, chasing rumors of my brother, does not leave much room for putting down roots anywhere. I have worked cattle drives from Texas to Montana, ridden shotgun on stage lines, hunted bounties when the money ran short, and none of it ever felt like more than a way to pass the time until the next lead came in. I had begun to wonder, before I rode into this town, whether I even remembered how to want anything beyond finding Caleb. And now that you have found him, Gideon considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Now I find that finding him has opened a door I thought was sealed shut for good. I find myself wanting things I had given up wanting. A home. A reason to stay in one place longer than a season. He looked at her then openly, and something passed between them that neither one named aloud, though both felt the shape of it settle into the room like warmth from a stove. "I find myself wanting, for instance, to know more of you, Miss Dugan, though I recognize the timing is poor, given that my brother's life hangs by the thinnest of threads." "Perhaps," Abigail said softly, "the timing is exactly why it matters. Men reveal a great deal about themselves in 3 days of crisis that they might otherwise take years to show. I find I am not sorry to know it, Mr. Archer, whatever the timing." They worked past midnight, and though they found nothing conclusive in the old newspapers beyond confirmation of Hargrove's aggressive land purchases over the preceding 2 years, something else had been found in those hours together, something neither of them spoke of directly but both of them carried when Gideon finally rode back to the jailhouse to sit vigil near his brother's cell, and Abigail banked her lamp and lay awake a long while, listening to the wind move through the cottonwoods outside her window, and thinking of gray eyes, and a voice roughened by hard years, and a rare, unguarded smile. The second day brought trouble in the form of a visit from Silas Hargrove himself, who arrived at the Gazette office shortly after dawn with 2 hired men flanking him, and an expression of careful, cold civility fixed upon his face. "Miss Dugan," he said, stepping into the small office without invitation, "I have come to offer you a friendly word of caution. I understand your sympathy for the Archer brothers, misplaced though it is, but I would remind you that this newspaper depends upon this town's goodwill to survive, and I would hate to see that goodwill withdrawn on account of a story that will, in the end, change nothing about the outcome of Caleb Archer's trial." "Is that a threat, Mr. Hargrove?" Abigail asked, not rising from her chair, though Gideon, who had arrived only moments before to discuss the day's plans, felt every muscle in his body tighten at the sight of the 2 hired men. "It is a friendly word of caution," Hargrove repeated, his smile not reaching his eyes. "I have many friends in this territory, Miss Dugan, friends among the bankers, friends among the freight companies that bring your paper stock and ink, friends among the men who might otherwise place advertisements in your pages. It would be a shame for all of that goodwill to dry up over a matter that will resolve itself in 3 days regardless of what you print. Get out of my office, Mr. Hargrove," Abigail said, her voice steady despite the pale set of her jaw. "I have printed the truth about worse men than you, and I will print the truth about you as well, whatever it costs me." Hargrove's gaze slid to Gideon, taking his measure with the cold assessment of a man accustomed to sizing up threats and deciding how much force each one required to remove. "And you, Mr. Archer?" I understand grief moves a man to desperate acts, but you would do well to remember that you are a stranger in this territory, with no standing, no property, and no friends beyond a newspaperwoman who has already made herself sufficiently unpopular with the men who matter. I would think carefully before making yourself any more of a nuisance than you already are. I have spent 17 years being told my brother was gone for good, Gideon said, rising slowly from his chair, his voice quiet in the way that made men who knew him take a step back. I have ridden through blizzards and across deserts and into towns that did not want me there, chasing nothing more than a name in a ledger and a prayer that it might lead somewhere true. You think a man like you, with your hired hands and your bank accounts, frightens me. I have faced down worse than you with far less reason to stand my ground than I have now. My brother is innocent, and I intend to prove it, and no threat you make is going to change that. For a moment, something flickered across Hargrove's composed face, a brief crack of uncertainty, quickly smoothed over. We shall see, Mr. Archer, what Judge Pearson makes of your brother's case. I suspect you will find the law less sentimental than you hope. He turned and left without another word, his hired men trailing after him, and the office was quiet for a long moment after the door swung shut. He is frightened, Abigail said, watching through the window as the three men mounted their horses and rode away. Men like Hargrove only threaten when they sense the ground shifting beneath them. Yesterday he believed this matter was already settled. Today he is not so certain. Then we are making progress, Gideon said, though the visit had left an uneasy weight in his chest that he could not entirely shake. That uneasiness proved well-founded, for it was that same afternoon, while Gideon rode out once more toward the homestead to search the ground more thoroughly in the daylight, that Abigail discovered the fire. She had stepped out of the Gazette office only briefly, to fetch water from the town well, and returned to find smoke curling from beneath the back door and a fire already climbing the wooden shelves where she stored her father's old newspaper archives, the very records that might have held further evidence of Hargrove's dealings. She screamed for help, and half the town came running with buckets, and between them they managed to save the front of the building and the press itself. But the back room, with 2 years of carefully preserved back issues, was reduced to ash and ruin by the time the flames were finally beaten down. Gideon returned to find her sitting on the boardwalk outside the smoking ruin of the back room, her face streaked with soot and tears she was fighting not to shed, and something in him broke open at the sight of her like that, small and shaken but still upright, still fighting to hold herself together. "Abigail," he said, using her given name for the first time, dropping to his knees beside her without any thought for propriety. "Are you hurt? Tell me you are not hurt." "I am not hurt," she said, though her voice trembled. "Only angry and angry that I am frightened because that is exactly what he wants. Hargrove did this." "I cannot prove it," she said. "Not yet, but who else would benefit from the destruction of 2 years of my father's and my own reporting on his land dealings? I had begun compiling a full account, Gideon, cross-referencing every purchase he had made, every homestead claim that mysteriously became available shortly after its owner suffered some misfortune. It is gone now. All of it." Gideon took her hands in his, ink-stained and trembling, and held them steady between his own weathered palms. "Then we build the case again, from what remains, and from what we can still gather in the time we have left. I will not let him frighten you into silence, Abigail, and I will not let him win by burning down the evidence of his own wrongdoing. We have 1 day left before the judge arrives. We will use it well." She looked up at him then, and whatever fear had gripped her seemed to steady itself against the calm certainty in his eyes, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply held each other's gaze in the smoky evening light while the town moved around them, still murmuring about the fire, still watching the two of them with a curiosity that neither noticed nor cared about. "Thank you," Abigail said finally, "for staying." "I could not do otherwise," Gideon said, "not for you." And though the words were simple, they carried a weight that both of them understood went beyond the case, beyond the fire, beyond even the desperate race to save Caleb's life. down into something neither of them had expected to find in the middle of such danger and grief, but which now felt as solid and undeniable as the ground beneath them. That night, unable to sleep, Gideon walked the length of the town twice over, turning the case over in his mind like a stone he could not stop worrying with his thumb. Wallace Prute's testimony would establish that Ezra Cole had visited the Hargrove ranch, but it would not prove that Hargrove had ordered Cole's death, nor that Cole had been planted on Caleb's land to frame him. They needed something more direct, something that connected the money to the murder, and as Gideon walked past the darkened windows of the saloon, an idea began to take shape. He returned to the jailhouse and woke his brother from a fitful sleep. "Caleb, think carefully. In the days before Ezra Cole died, did anything unusual happen? Anyone visit your land who had no clear business being there? Anything at all out of the ordinary?" Caleb rubbed his eyes, thinking hard. "There was a man," he said slowly, "about a week before who came by claiming to be a surveyor, said he was mapping the river bend for the Territorial Land Office. I did not think much of it at the time, but he asked a great many questions about the boundaries of my claim and about whether I had filed all my paperwork properly with the land office in Cheyenne. Did he give a name? Yes, Grimshaw, I believe. Orville Grimshaw." Gideon felt a spark of hope kindle in his chest. "If that man is connected to Hargrove, and if he was scouting your claim for some purpose beyond honest surveying, that could be another thread. Land office records are public, Caleb. If a man named Grimshaw exists and works for the Territorial Survey, we can find him, and we can ask him plainly who sent him and why." At dawn, Gideon rode to the small telegraph office at the edge of town and sent an urgent message to the land office in Cheyenne, inquiring after any surveyor named Orville Grimshaw employed in the territory. The reply came back within hours, carried by the telegraph operator himself, a thin young man named Percy, who seemed rather pleased to be involved in something more exciting than routine cattle price reports. "No surveyor named Orville Grimshaw is registered with this office," the telegram read. "No survey of the Sweetwater River Bend has been authorized or conducted by this office within the past calendar year." "Then whoever this Grimshaw is," Abigail said, reading the telegram over Gideon's shoulder, her hand resting lightly on his arm in a gesture that had become natural between them in the space of only 2 days. "He was not sent by any legitimate authority. Someone paid him to pose as a surveyor, to scout Caleb's land and confirm its boundaries and its value, almost certainly in preparation for a purchase or a seizure once the land became available. And if we can find this Grimshaw," Gideon said, "and if he can be persuaded to say who hired him, we will have Hargrove's own scheme laid bare in his own hired man's words." Finding Grimshaw proved less difficult than either of them expected, for Wallace Prute, once pressed, recalled that a man matching the description had stabled a horse at his livery some weeks back and had mentioned, in an unguarded moment, that he was staying at a boarding house in the mining town of Split Rock, some 15 miles to the south, while he waited for further instructions from his employer. There was no time to spare. Judge Pearson's train was due to arrive the following afternoon, and Split Rock was a hard half-day's ride each way. Gideon made the decision quickly, saddling his horse before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. "I am coming with you," Abigail said, already pulling on her riding gloves. "It may be dangerous," Gideon said, though he already knew from the set of her jaw that argument would be wasted breath. "Everything in this business has been dangerous since the moment your brother's neck met that rope," she said. "I did not run from the fire, Gideon Archer, and I do not intend to run from this either. Besides, you may need someone who can write down a confession properly, in a hand a judge can read, and swear to its accuracy before witnesses. That is precisely the sort of thing a newspaper editor is trained to do." They rode hard for Split Rock, reaching the small, rough mining settlement by mid-morning, and it took only a brief inquiry at the general store to learn which boarding house had taken in a stranger some weeks prior. Orville Grimshaw proved to be a small, nervous man with ink-stained fingers not unlike Abigail's own, though his came from forging surveys rather than printing truth. And when Gideon confronted him in the narrow hallway of the boarding house, the man's composure crumbled almost at once. "I did not know he meant to kill anyone," Grimshaw said, his voice shaking. Once Gideon had made clear that a murder charge for complicity was very much a possibility unless the man cooperated fully. "Hargrove paid me $200 to survey the Archer claim and report on its exact boundaries and water access. That is all I was told, I swear it. I did not know about the man who died. I only heard of it after the fact, from one of Hargrove's other hired men, a fellow named Boone, who bragged, when he was in his cups, that he had helped arrange for a drifter to be found dead on the Archer land on Hargrove's orders, so that the claim would fall into forfeiture." "Will you swear to that before Judge Pearson in writing?" Abigail asked, already opening her notebook, her pencil poised. Grimshaw hesitated only a moment before nodding, the fear of the noose apparently outweighing whatever loyalty he had felt toward Hargrove's money. "I will swear to what I know, if it means I am not hanged alongside a man I never meant to help kill." Abigail took down his statement in careful, precise handwriting and had him sign it, and Gideon added his own signature as witness. And by the time they rowed back toward Sweetwater Crossing in the long gold light of late afternoon, they carried with them not only Grimshaw's sworn statement but also a name, Boone, that might yet crack the case fully open. They rode through the night, exhausted but unwilling to rest until they had reached the safety of the jailhouse, and it was somewhere in those dark hours, with the stars wheeling overhead and the horses' hooves beating a steady rhythm against the packed earth of the trail, that Gideon finally allowed himself to say the words that had been building in his chest since the moment he first heard Abigail Dugan's voice rise above a hostile crowd in defense of a man she had never met. "Abigail," he said, drawing his horse alongside hers as they slowed to rest the animals near a shallow creek crossing. "I do not know what will happen tomorrow, whether Judge Pearson will believe our evidence, whether Caleb will go free, or whether this entire effort will come to nothing. But I know that whatever happens, I do not wish to ride away from this town without you knowing what has grown in me these past 3 days." She turned to look at him in the moonlight, her expression soft and searching. "Tell me, then." "I love you," he said simply, the words plain and unadorned because he had never learned the art of flowery speech, only the honest labor of a man who said what he meant and meant what he said. "I did not expect to find such a thing in the midst of searching for my brother, and I did not expect to find it in a woman brave enough to stand against a man like Hargrove with nothing but a pencil and a fierce heart. But I have found it all the same, and I would be a poor sort of man if I let this night pass without telling you so." Abigail's breath caught, and for a moment she said nothing, simply studied his face in the pale light as though memorizing it. "I love you as well, Gideon Archer," she said finally. "I did not think I would ever again meet a man who valued truth and family and courage as much as my father did, and I find I have met one in the unlikeliest of circumstances, riding into my town at the very moment I most needed to believe such men still existed." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand, and they rode the rest of the way to Sweetwater Crossing with their fingers laced together, saying little more, needing little more, the promise of what had passed between them settling comfortably into the quiet dark. They arrived back in town just as dawn was breaking and found the streets already stirring with unusual activity, for the morning train from Cheyenne was due within hours, carrying Judge Pearson to preside over the territorial circuit court, and with it, the fate of Caleb Archer would finally be decided. Sheriff Whitlock met them at the jailhouse, his face grave. "Hargrove has been busy while you were gone," he said. "He has been telling anyone who will listen that the delay was nothing more than a stalling tactic by a desperate brother, and that Judge Pearson ought to proceed straight to sentencing, without wasting the court's time on further testimony." I do not know how much sway he holds with Pearson, but the man has a way of getting what he wants in this territory, and I would not put it past him to have sent word ahead somehow. We have sworn testimony, Gideon said, showing the Sheriff Grimshaw's statement, connecting Hargrove to a false survey of my brother's land, and naming a man called Boone as having boasted of helping to plant Ezra Cole's body on that land under Hargrove's orders. It is not yet a full confession, but it is more than enough to demand a proper investigation before any verdict is rendered. Whitlock read the statement twice, his mustache twitching. This Boone, I know the man. Works as one of Hargrove's hired guns, has done for a year or more. If we can bring him in and press him the right way, we might get the confession outright. He straightened, some of the old lawman's resolve returning to his bearing. Leave it to me. I will have my deputy ride out and bring Boone in before the court convenes. You two get some rest, and get your brother ready to face the judge with his head held high. The circuit court convened that afternoon in the largest room available in Sweetwater Crossing, the town hall, its benches packed with nearly every resident for miles, drawn by the drama that had gripped the community for 3 tense days. Judge Pearson proved to be a stern, silver-haired man with sharp eyes that missed little, and he listened with evident interest as Gideon presented Grimshaw's sworn statement, as Wallace Prout testified nervously but firmly about Ezra Cole's visits to the Hargrove Ranch, and as Abigail Dugan, called as a witness to the fire that had destroyed her newspaper's records, described the timing of that fire and its clear connection to her investigation into Hargrove's land dealings. Silas Hargrove sat near the front of the room, flanked by a hired attorney, his composure fraying visibly as witness after witness painted a picture he could not easily dismiss. "This is a coordinated slander," Hargrove's attorney protested, "orchestrated by a newspaperwoman with a personal vendetta and a drifter desperate to save his own brother's neck. None of this proves that my client had any hand in the death of Ezra Cole." "Your Honor," Sheriff Whitlock said, rising from where he had been seated near the back of the room, "if the court will permit, I have just this hour brought in a man named Boone, one of Mr. Hargrove's hired hands, who has agreed to testify as to his knowledge of these events, in exchange for leniency regarding his own involvement." A murmur rippled through the crowded room, and Hargrove's face went the color of old ash as the deputy escorted a rough-looking man in through the side door, his hands cuffed, his eyes darting nervously toward his former employer before settling, with something like relief, on the judge. "Tell the court what you know, Mr. Boone," Judge Pearson said, "and be aware that any falsehood will go far worse for you than the truth, however uncomfortable that truth may be." Boone swallowed hard. "Hargrove paid me and another fellow, name of Ezra Cole, to stir up trouble for Caleb Archer, on account of Archer refusing to sell his land. We were meant just to scare him some, cut fences, run cattle over his crops, that sort of thing. But Cole got greedy, started demanding more money, threatened to go to the sheriff about the whole arrangement if Hargrove did not pay him double what he had promised. Hargrove told me to handle it quiet-like. I did not kill Cole myself, Your Honor. I swear that before God. But I helped move his body onto Archer's land after Hargrove shot him in a rage during an argument out at the ranch house, because Hargrove said it would solve 2 problems at once: silence Cole and put the blame square on Archer for the murder." The room erupted into noise, townsfolk gasping and murmuring, and Judge Pearson banged his gavel hard against the bench, demanding order, while Silas Hargrove surged to his feet, his face contorted with fury. "This man is lying to save his own worthless neck," Hargrove shouted, but the desperation in his voice betrayed him, and Judge Pearson's cold, assessing gaze made it plain that the judge, at least, was not persuaded by the denial. "Sheriff Whitlock," the judge said, "take Mr. Hargrove into custody pending a full investigation into these charges. Given the gravity of the accusations, including conspiracy to commit murder and the destruction of evidence by fire, bail will not be considered at this time." He turned his attention to Caleb, who sat pale but upright at the defendant's table, hardly daring to breathe. "As for you, Mr. Archer, in light of this testimony, I find no basis upon which to proceed with charges against you. You are free to go, with the court's apology for the ordeal you have endured, and my personal recommendation that this county's law enforcement conduct a far more thorough investigation before ever again bringing a man so close to the gallows on such thin evidence." The room broke into applause and exclamation, and Caleb sagged in his chair, tears streaming freely down his face as Gideon rushed forward to embrace him, both brothers laughing and weeping in equal measure. 17 years of separation and 3 days of terror finally giving way to relief, so profound it left them both trembling. Silas Hargrove was led away in irons, shouting protests that grew fainter as the deputy marched him toward the jailhouse, his hired attorney following with an expression of grim resignation, already calculating, no doubt, how little he could do for a client so thoroughly exposed. Boone was returned to a cell as well, to await his own reckoning for his part in the crime, though his cooperation would likely spare him the full weight of the noose he had so casually helped arrange for another man. Abigail found Gideon in the midst of the celebrating crowd, and he turned at her approach and swept her into an embrace that lifted her briefly off her feet, laughing with an unguarded joy that transformed his weathered, careworn face into something almost boyish. "We did it," he said. "Abigail, we did it. He is free. My brother is free." "You did it," she said, laughing herself now, tears bright in her eyes. "I only helped hold the pencil steady." "You held far more than a pencil steady these past 3 days," he said, growing quieter, though the joy in his eyes did not dim. "You held me steady, Abigail Dugan, when I did not know how to hold myself together, and I do not intend to let that steadying hand go, not now, not ever, if you will have me." The crowd around them had begun to notice, falling into an expectant hush as Gideon dropped to one knee right there in the town hall, heedless of the dust and the onlookers, holding both of Abigail's hands in his. "I have no ring to offer you," he said, "and no home to bring you to beyond whatever I can build with my own 2 hands, but I have a heart that is entirely yours and a promise that I will spend the whole of my life proving myself worthy of the courage you have shown me. Abigail Dugan, will you marry me?" Abigail laughed through her tears, nodding before she could even find the words, and when the words did come they were simple and sure. "Yes, Gideon Archer. Yes, 1,000 times yes." The room erupted into cheers louder even than those that had greeted Caleb's acquittal, and Sheriff Whitlock, standing nearby with a rare smile breaking through his tired features, called out that the town ought to declare a holiday, seeing as they had witnessed both a man saved from the gallows and a proposal of marriage in the same afternoon, which was more excitement than Sweetwater Crossing had seen in a decade. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in early summer, when the wildflowers along the Sweetwater River had come into full bloom and the days had grown long and golden. It was a modest affair by the standards of grander towns back east, held in the churchyard with the whole of Sweetwater Crossing in attendance, for the story of the drifter who had found his long-lost brother beneath a hangman's noose, and won the heart of the town's own fierce newspaperwoman in the process, had spread through the territory and become something of a local legend even before the ink of the wedding announcement had dried in Abigail's rebuilt press. Caleb stood as his brother's best man, looking healthier and more at peace than he had in the desperate days before the trial, his homestead claim now secured beyond any question, the land along the river bend confirmed as rightfully his by the Territorial Land Office, with an official apology besides for the ordeal he had suffered. Silas Hargrove had been convicted at a subsequent trial in Cheyenne, his testimony from Boone and Grimshaw proving more than sufficient to secure a lengthy sentence in the territorial prison, his land holdings seized and auctioned to satisfy the many debts and legal judgments that followed swiftly once his carefully built empire of intimidation crumbled. Wallace Prout, who had found unexpected courage in testifying, took over management of a portion of Hargrove's former stables, and Sheriff Whitlock, chastened by how close he had come to allowing an innocent man's death, became known thereafter as one of the most careful and fair-minded lawmen in the territory, a reputation he guarded fiercely for the remainder of his long career. Abigail wore a simple dress of pale blue calico, her dark hair crowned with a wreath of wildflowers gathered that very morning by a gaggle of local children who had appointed themselves her personal attendants, and when she walked down the short aisle formed by the gathered townsfolk, Gideon felt his breath catch in his chest in a way that no danger, no gunfight, no 17 years of hard searching had ever managed to accomplish. "I, Gideon Archer, take you, Abigail Dugan," he said, his voice steady and sure despite the emotion thickening it, "to be my wife, to walk beside in all the seasons of our lives, in hardship and in joy, in the dust of the trail and the warmth of the hearth, for as long as we both shall live." "I, Abigail Dugan, take you, Gideon Archer," she answered, her eyes bright with happy tears, "to be my husband, to stand beside you against whatever injustice this world may offer, to build with you a home founded on truth and courage, for as long as we both shall live." The preacher pronounced them man and wife to thunderous applause, and the town celebrated late into the evening with music from a fiddle and a borrowed guitar, with tables groaning under the weight of dishes brought by nearly every household in Sweetwater Crossing, with dancing that spilled out into the street beneath a sky blazing with more stars than either of them had ever paused to count. Caleb, for his part, did not remain unattached for long, for among the many townsfolk who had rallied to support the Archer brothers during the trial had been a young widow named Mary Ellen Foster, who ran the town's small dry goods store and had brought food to the jailhouse during those tense 3 days out of simple compassion, only to find herself increasingly drawn to the quiet, gentle strength of the man she had helped feed. Within the year, Caleb and Mary Ellen were wed as well, in a smaller ceremony held at Caleb's own homestead beside the river, and the bond between the two Archer households grew as strong and steady as the river itself. Brothers reunited not only in blood, but in the shared building of new families upon the very land that had once nearly cost one of them his life. Gideon and Abigail settled first in a small house behind the rebuilt Gazette office, for Abigail had no intention of abandoning her father's newspaper, and Gideon found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he had a talent for the printing trade himself, his steady hands well suited to the careful work of setting type, and his years of hard travel giving him a storyteller's eye for which news mattered most to the people of the territory. Together they expanded the paper's reach, and Abigail's fearless reporting on land disputes, water rights, and the treatment of homesteaders throughout the region earned the Gazette a reputation that extended well beyond Sweetwater Crossing, drawing subscribers from towns up and down the territory who had grown weary of newspapers too timid to speak plainly about the injustices wealthy men like Hargrove had for too long inflicted upon ordinary settlers with little recourse to fight back. In time, Gideon also took up a portion of land adjoining Caleb's homestead, and the two brothers built a modest ranching operation together, running cattle along the good grazing that Hargrove had once so coveted, the very water access that had nearly cost Caleb his life, now sustaining 2 thriving households instead of feeding one man's greed. It seemed a fitting justice, Abigail often said, that the land meant to be seized through murder and deceit had instead become the foundation for 2 families built on love and loyalty. Their first child, a boy, was born the following spring, and they named him Thomas, after Sheriff Whitlock, who had found the courage at the crucial moment to choose justice over convenience, and who wept unashamedly when Gideon told him of the honor, insisting gruffly that it was entirely unnecessary, and then holding the infant with a tenderness that surprised everyone who had only ever known him as a weathered, no-nonsense lawman. 2 years later, a daughter followed, whom they named Grace, for the mercy that had spared Caleb's life in the very last hour before it might have been lost forever, and Abigail liked to say, rocking her daughter beside the warm hearth of their home on quiet evenings, that Grace was the truest name she had ever chosen. For Grace was precisely what had brought her husband riding into town at the exact moment his brother's life hung by a fraying rope, and Grace was what had allowed two strangers, thrown together by crisis, to discover in each other a love neither had thought themselves likely to find. Caleb and Mary Ellen, too, welcomed children of their own in the years that followed, a boy first and then twin girls, and the two Archer households grew close as the seasons turned, the cousins running wild together along the riverbank in summer, gathering for shared suppers on Sunday evenings that echoed, in their own way, the family warmth that Gideon and Caleb had lost so young and had spent so many years trying to reclaim. Sweetwater Crossing itself prospered in the years that followed, the shadow of Hargrove's corruption lifting gradually as honest commerce and fair dealing took root in its place, and the town came to regard the story of Gideon Archer and Abigail Dugan, and of Caleb Archer's near-hanging and miraculous last-minute rescue, as something of a founding legend, told and retold at gatherings and taught to children as a lesson in the power of persistence, of courage, and of love found in the unlikeliest and most desperate of circumstances. On the 10th anniversary of that terrible morning in the town square, Gideon and Abigail walked together, hand in hand as they so often did, past the very spot where the gallows had once stood, long since dismantled and replaced by a small public garden that Abigail herself had helped design, filled with the same wildflowers that had crowned her on her wedding day. "Do you ever think of it?" Abigail asked, as they paused beside the garden, their two children racing ahead of them toward the riverbank where Caleb and Mary Ellen's brood were already splashing in the shallows. "Every day," Gideon admitted, not with grief any longer but with a kind of wonder. "If I had arrived in this town a single hour later, Abigail, I would have lost my brother forever, and I would never have known you at all. It seems a fearful thing, how close we all came to a very different ending. But we did not arrive too late," she said, squeezing his hand. "You arrived exactly when you were meant to, and found exactly what you needed to find, both your brother and, though you did not know it yet, your wife." Gideon smiled, drawing her close against his side as they watched their children play in the golden afternoon light, the river running steady and bright beside them, the same river that had once nearly cost his brother his life and now sustained two thriving families in its place. "I have thought a great deal, these 10 years, about all those years I spent searching, wondering whether I would ever find what I had lost. I did not know then that the search would lead me not only to my brother, but to the truest home I have ever known, standing right here beside this river with you." "Then I am glad," Abigail said, "that you never stopped searching." "I am glad," he answered, "that you never stopped fighting for the truth, even when it cost you everything you had worked to build. It was that courage that first told me who you were, Abigail Archer, long before I ever found the words to tell you what I felt." She laughed softly at the sound of her married name, still new enough after 10 years to bring her a small flicker of joy each time she heard it spoken in his voice. "Abigail Archer," she repeated. "I think I shall never tire of hearing it said that way." They stood together a while longer in the fading afternoon light, watching their children grow up strong and free upon land that had once nearly been stained with injustice and was now, through their shared courage and enduring love, a place of homecoming, of family, and of the kind of hard-won peace that only comes to those who have fought together for something worth having. The rope that had once hung around Caleb Archer's neck was long since burned, the man who had ordered it long since imprisoned, and in its place had grown something far stronger and far more lasting. A family reunited, a love discovered against all odds, and a town made better for the truth that two brave hearts had refused to let die. And so it was that in Sweetwater Crossing, Wyoming Territory, where a hangman's rope had once nearly severed a family forever, love instead had woven two families together, binding brother to brother and husband to wife in a bond that not even 17 years of separation, nor the schemes of a corrupt and powerful man, had been able to break. And the story of Gideon Archer, who found his long-lost brother wearing a hangman's rope around his neck and found, in the very same desperate hour, the woman who would become the love of his life, was told and cherished for generations to come, a testament to the enduring truth that even in the darkest and most desperate of moments, hope and love have a way of arriving exactly when they are needed most.